It has been stated by some journalists and historians that George W. Bush has brought about the most faith-based administration in American history. This program will attempt to determine whether or not that statement is true, and if it is, what effect has his faith had on America and on the world?
Historians may quibble, but the fact is, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and George W. Bush are the only presidents who have had to contend with the ravages of war on our own soil. The reliance placed on God by both Washington and Lincoln is well documented. But what do we know about George W. Bush? Is he a man of faith? Very early on, while still campaigning for the nomination, he implied that he was. When the moderator in the Iowa debate asked each candidate to name the philosopher they admired most.
Governor Bush, a philosopher thinker, and why?
Christ, because he changed my heart.
The question was simple and straightforward. The answer came without hesitation. But in the nation's capital, a shockwave rumbled through the halls of government. Could it be that a candidate for President of the United States would actually fly in the face of political correctness and espouse not just religious convictions, but a firm belief in Jesus Christ? Critics and pundits were quick to suggest Bush had committed political suicide and asked, is this candidate totally out of touch with the American mainstream? Or is he just a politician cynically pandering to the voters of the religious right? Bush's answer was clear and to the point. My faith is an integral part of my whole being. That's what faith is. I don't think you can separate your faith from who you are. Could it be that a major political figure had arrived in the scene who was willing to admit he was guided by a resolute moral compass, firmly fixed in the principles of Christianity? Far from committing political suicide, Bush won, by the narrowest margin in political history. Now the question was, had the nation elected a man of faith and strong Christian principles, or simply a clever political opportunist? The answers to those questions would turn out to be more critical than anyone could have possibly imagined. Only 7 months into his presidency, the tragic events of September 11th turned the country away from such routine concerns as the economy, education, and taking care of a family, and forced us to deal with the complexities of a world in which America was no longer safe from catastrophic attack. Had we elected a leader who could inspire confidence and hope? Is George Bush a man with the spiritual strength to meet this awful challenge? Or is he just another pandering politician paying lip service to the idea of God?
I think that the viewer would like to know more on how he's changed your heart.
Well, if they don't know, it's going to be hard to explain. When you turn your heart and your life over to Christ, when you accept Christ as a Savior, it changes your heart, it changes your life. And that's what happened to me.
Predictably, reaction to Bush's comment in the Iowa debate was confusion, even among some of his closest friends and advisors.
When he made the Christ statement, I knew he was speaking from the heart, but as a friend, I thought he had committed political suicide.
When I heard Bush speak so frankly from his heart about Christ, I knew he had just won the election.
The controversy engendered by Bush's remark would continue throughout the campaign. But one thing became apparently clear. In spite of the fact that every president of the United States has expressed deference to and at least some reverence for God, in the case of Bush, his critics even today seem almost angry in their denunciations. Jim Wallace in Sojourner magazine writes,
to this aggressive extension of American power in the world, President George W. Bush adds God, and that changes the picture dramatically. It's one thing for a nation to assert its raw dominance in the world. It's quite another to suggest that his presidency may be a divine appointment for a time such as this.
The president, however, was not without his supporters, among them longtime friend and political advisor to George Bush Sr., Doug Wead.
All the better, Bush has a moral clarity befitting a world leader as opposed to the relativist view of many European leaders and much of the left in this country.
Many Americans today seem to be re-evaluating their spiritual lives, trying to get at what is most important. Could it be that religious moral clarity is precisely what the public is looking for in a leader? In spite of pundits and politicians, it seems that mainstream America does in fact want leadership with strong moral and ethical character. Following the attack of September 11th, the nation's churches were filled. People all across the country rallied behind President Bush. Still, there was an undercurrent of fear and doubt in America that could be felt from the most humble pew to the highest levels of government. At such a time, the nation needed strong moral leadership and genuine statesmanship. But do most Americans necessarily connect a man of faith with a person they can trust? Indeed, the president's critics are quick to claim that precisely the opposite is true. For example, screen actor Richard Gere was quoted as saying,
"One thing I've learned in my life is never to trust anyone who thinks that he exclusively has God on his side, especially when he's the President of the United States."
From the outside, you've got attacks on America and on the rest of the Western world from radical Islamic fundamentalism. At the same time, there's a struggle going on inside America, and it's a struggle between those who regard Judeo-Christian values as vital for our nation's survival and those who view those values as horrible obstructions to progress. The future of our nation depends upon the outcome of this struggle.
given that fact, what is there to suggest that a man of faith is more trustworthy? Are there historic examples of great leaders who, when faced with critical choices, found strength in prayer and supplication? George Washington, the great hero of the Revolution, our first president and often referred to as the father of our country, said,
"It is impossible to rightly govern in the world without God and the Bible."
If that's true, then the question becomes, is George Bush a man of sufficient spiritual strength and dedication to lead the nation through the difficult times we are facing, both inside the nation and from without? Those who know him best, such as religious broadcaster and friend James Robeson, believe he is up to the task.
I'm convinced that President Bush has very deep convictions related to his beliefs based upon principles that could be traced back to the Judeo-Christian ethic. I do not believe for one moment, however, that he would seek to manipulate others nor impose his beliefs. I think that he, in the truest sense of the word, seeks to let the light shine, and its radiant effect has a positive effect on others.
Every person I've taken to meet the president is immediately won over by the sincerity of his faith, but they're also struck by the fact that he doesn't make grandiose claims about it. President Bush's form of Christianity is somewhere in between mainstream Christianity and evangelicalism. It's very compatible with Catholicism as well, but he's really a kind of perfect mediator between the mainstream Catholics and evangelicals.
He is, by all accounts, a deeply religious man and one who believes in the power of prayer. In fact, I've heard several accounts of the president being found in the Oval Office on his knees in prayer.
My oldest son, Rob, was a part of the George Bush campaign for president and later became chief of staff of the Department of Housing and Urban Development and an advisor to Vice President Cheney. On February 8, 2003, we received this hurried call. My son, Jamal, said that, "Dad, we're overturned in the car." And the rescue workers came and told us that our son was dead. And the next day, we were just a mess. And then about 10:30 in the morning, I was lying on the bed and my wife comes into the room with the phone and says, "Bob, President Bush is on the phone. He's calling from Air Force One." And it just sort of amazed me. And so I took the phone and the president said, "Bob, how sorry I am that Rob died, my precious friend." And he consoled me for about 7 minutes. And he said, I'm getting ready to call Michelle and pray with her. And he called my daughter-in-law, Michelle, and she told me that he read scripture and prayed with her. And she said, well, Mr. President, I'm just happy that you're calling, but I know you have heavy burdens. He said, Michelle, you are the one that we need to be talking about and concentrating on, not me. But if you need me, you know where Laura, know where we are. I was just so moved and uplifted that a man of such importance, with all of the burdens of the world on his shoulders, that he could take the time to console us at this moment. And in the next week, I had 2 other occasions to be with the president at a small breakfast at the White House. And I was again amazed because as we greeted one another, he kissed me on the cheek and was nearly in tears, and I found myself comforting him because he said, oh, I miss Rob so much. He was so much a part of this campaign, so much a part of my life. And I'll never forget this man, as long as I live, for what he did to comfort us.
How did the president come to be such a man of faith, of prayer, and of love? From all accounts, he was just another hard-drinking young man caught up in the boom and bust of the oil business in Midland, Texas. Where did he learn to walk with God? Is there something in the life of George W. Bush that made him uniquely qualified to lead America through one of the most difficult periods in our nation's history?
Do ye solemnly believe all the articles of the Christian faith as contained in the Apostles' Creed? And do ye acknowledge the obligation, as far as in you lies, to provide that this child be brought up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, that he be diligently instructed in the Holy Scriptures, and he be taught the Creed, the Lord's Prayer, the 10 Commandments, and all other things which a Christian ought to know and believe to his soul's health?
We do.
George W. Bush is the firstborn son of a man who believed strongly in the spiritual roots of his family and the nation. But his father was also a man who was willing to set aside the trappings of wealth to which he was born. Intent on making it on his own in what was called the oil patch, George Herbert Walker Bush moved his young family to Midland, Texas. As a boy, George W. Bush attended San Jacinto Junior High, ran for president of his 7th class, and won. He got straight A's, starred in football and baseball, and was known as a popular kid with a big mouth. He was arrogant, aggressive, fast, and sarcastic. It was not the ideal resume for a future president of the United States. His world was a combination of Texas bravado and the transplanted Ivy League of his father.
If it's true a man is a product of his environment, the environment in which George W. Bush grew up in Midland, Texas in the 50s was very similar to the one in which I grew up. You had your old hard-knock ranchers and your old hard-drinking, hard-driving oil field people, and then you had some executives moving in. People accepted you for your word, for your integrity, and for how capable you were at your job. Politics was certainly something people talked about, but most of the men in Midland, frankly, weren't interested in things outside Texas too much.
But religion was an important part of George Bush's upbringing, as evidenced by the Bush family involvement in Midland's First Presbyterian Church. It was a life full of opportunities for a boy to grow into manhood with a solid example of parents, friends, and community to follow.
Knowing George as I know him and knowing how he and his wife and daughters were when they were in Midland is somewhat of a snapshot of the way he grew up in the 50s, which was loyalty to his marriage, to his family. Things he was interested in were doing well in school, doing well in athletics, being true to your word, faith, family, and friends.
Only one thing seems to have marred George's childhood. His little sister Robin lost a 7-month battle with leukemia. The psychological stress of depression in the family was so severe that they actually felt physical pain.
Bush has described the death of his sister as the starkest memory of his childhood, a sharp pain in the midst of an otherwise happy blur. What's more, George felt the anguish of his parents very deeply, especially that of his grieving mother. David Aikman, author of A Man of Faith, The Spiritual Journey of George Bush, picks up the story.
When his father was away from home, George W. assumed a protective presence over his mother, and even though he was only a boy, he felt the most important thing in life was to comfort her. It got to where he would do just about anything to cheer her. He'd tell stories, jokes, anything to see a smile on his mother's face again. One day, Barbara heard George W. telling a boyhood friend that he couldn't come out and play with him because his mother needed him. In her memoirs, Barbara Bush would write that that was the moment that her cure began. She realized that her grief was too much of a burden for her 7-year-old son to carry.
This story reveals something about George W. Bush that's very, very important. He felt that he could lift the depression in the family home and change the mood by his presence, by his stories. I believe that as a leader, he feels the same thing, and this is what we see following September the 11th.
But there were other influences in Midland as well, and a young George Bush, with the mud of the oil patch on his boots and a thirst that comes with a throat full of Texas dust, was not immune from them. Critics suggested that you can take the boy out of Midland, but you can't take Midland out of the boy. According to Bob Woodson, civil rights activist and founder of neighborhood-based organizations to prevent gang violence, the president addressed that notion with typical Bush candor.
After he became president, I joined a group of religious leaders meeting in the White House with the president. He said, you know, I had a drinking problem one time. I really should be in a bar in Texas, not in the Oval Office. But only through the grace of God and His mercy and through the power of prayer was I delivered from my problems. And I ask you to pray for me.
Today, the majority of church-going Americans believe George W. Bush is the right man at the right time. But the president, by his own admission, spent many years chasing the good life, smoking, drinking, cursing, and carousing with his friends. Then, on the verge of his 40th birthday, he made a decision that turned his life around.
In the course of writing a book about the spiritual journey of George W. Bush, I met many of the president's closest friends and advisors, and I was struck by the fact that those who have known him the longest, those who knew him in his partying days and after his conversion to Christ, were amazed and marveled at the transformation that took place. It was a stunning change.
According to his father's youngest brother, affectionately known in family circles as Uncle Bucky, one of those changes was putting behind him the excesses of his youth.
When George W. Bush turned 40 in July of 1986, he and Laura, with some friends, went to Colorado Springs to celebrate his birthday. That evening, he had too much wine to drink at dinner, and when he woke up the next morning, he had a hangover. He went out for a 3-mile run, which is his practice, and during that 3-mile run, he decided he was never going to take another drink. And he came back and he told Laura that morning that he was never going to take another drink.
Of course, many of us have heard that kind of commitment, especially from heavy drinkers who want to stop, but soon slip back into another drinking binge. Would this be just one of those commitments, soon to be discarded?
George just isn't like that. When he made that commitment to Laura, he was suddenly stone cold sober. And he had the character and the willingness and the capacity to remain that way the rest of his life. I'm sure it was his Christian faith that gave him the strength to do so. I mean, if his faith was somewhat lax before that, it certainly wasn't afterwards. He became a changed man in a lot of ways. He stopped chewing and cussing and became an extraordinarily disciplined guy.
He told me that that he had had an encounter with God that had not only changed his life where he was no longer drinking at all, totally quit, but that had redirected his future. And I believe, frankly, the greatest change in President Bush is not what he stopped doing, but what he began to do. He began to live for others.
It's unbelievable how he structures his White House day to include, in addition to his long work day, a physical workout, prayer time, Bible reading, time to talk with his girls, his wife, his parents, in addition to reading a 12-inch stack of briefing papers and a book every single day. What's even more amazing is his respect for the Oval Office itself. He treats it like a sacred trust, a sacred place, and won't even enter the Oval Office without wearing a suit, even during non-working hours on the weekend. And he also expects everyone else to wear proper business attire. There are no casual dress Fridays, and what's more, he expects everyone to respect each other, to be on time for meetings, to get their work in on time, and he encourages everyone to pray and read the Bible every day.
But this regimen and his reliance on prayer drives some critics up the wall. Robert Shear of the LA Times wrote,
Of course, as a self-described messenger of God who was praying for strength to do the Lord's will, Bush was not troubled about shredding a little secular document called the U.S. Constitution.
According to this line of reasoning, and in spite of over 225 years of history to the contrary, the notion that our leaders should have God in their lives has suddenly become threatening to the public good. But for the moment, let's give critics the benefit of the doubt. How can we be sure the faith of George W. Bush is a positive thing for America?
Because it makes him a better person. According to Bush, religion is more than a church, a synagogue, or a temple, or a mosque. It is the externalized values of a people. It is the things that people are concerned most deeply about. And that is why Bush is who he is.
And we know faith can help change our culture. Faith is the framework for living. It gives us a spirit and heart that affect everything we do. It gives us hope each day. Faith gives us purpose to right wrongs, to preserve our families, and to teach our children values. Faith gives us conscience to keep us honest, even when nobody else is looking. And faith can change lives. I know firsthand, because faith changed mine.
But if that's true, there should be observable consequences of that faith on the presidency. What effect, if any, is the faith of George W. Bush having on America? Can the fact that a strong man of faith is in the White House help America win the war on terrorism and still beat back the assault on traditional American values? George W. Bush, perhaps more than any president of the modern era, has opened his heart to the nation. He makes no bones about his problems with alcohol in his younger days, and he is just as candid about his Christian faith. We asked Tom Freiling, author of George W. Bush on God and Country, if that candor was having an effect on America.
I think it has clearly given Christians the strength to be more bold in their witness, in their own Christian walk. It has also given strength to Christians who are in the middle of fighting the culture war. Whether it be the issues of abortion or same-sex marriage, I think because President Bush has been so outspoken about his faith, it has allowed, or not even allowed, encouraged other Christians and especially Christian leaders to be the same way. I don't think they feel like they have to hide their Christian faith because the president doesn't hide it.
Still, there are critics who claim his conversion had more to do with politics than religion. Al Franken, a comedian turned political pundit, has said,
Obviously, part of the premise is that this is not the most honest administration. So, I don't know what to think of his religiosity. I really can't tell you, but I'm suspicious. I'm very suspicious of the way he uses it. I'm suspicious that it's done for political purposes and that he really isn't as religious as he makes out to be.
Given the fact that the change in Bush's life happened about the time he was working on his father's presidential campaign, the questions frequently asked are, what was it that brought about such a profound change in a young man who, to that point, had expressed no interest in politics? Was there a sudden flashpoint, or was it simply the final step in a long process?
By the mid-1980s, George Bush Sr. had become a huge public figure, and GW was anxious to help him, eager to help him, but he was nevertheless living in this long shadow of his father. This had to be difficult because George W. is a very talented guy in his own right, but trying to outdo the legacy of a father like George Bush Sr., that was a daunting task.
Like so many people, George W. Bush's life before Christ came into it was spent just trying to find his way. He'd had some success in his professional life and started his own oil exploration company. And in his personal life, he'd met and married a woman he loved, Laura, who is a strong Methodist. The problem was that he was really a man without direction, and as he neared middle age, he realized that he was going nowhere, and he desperately needed God.
In April of 1984, the gentleman named Arthur Blessed, who's a roving evangelist, the man who carried the cross around the world, had been invited back to Midland for a week's worth of evangelistic meetings. And George asked what I did Sunday night, and I said, well, I went to hear this guy, Arthur Blessed. And he said, oh, I heard him too. And I said, really? And I asked George, what did you think of him? Because I trusted George, had very good instincts about people, was a very astute judge of character. And he said, Don, I think he's the real deal. He said, well, I met with him. And I said, oh, you did? He said, yeah, I met with him this afternoon. Called another friend of ours, a mutual acquaintance named Jim Sale.
The meeting took place here. When it concluded, George Bush, Jim Sale, and Arthur Blessed held hands and prayed together. Then George tried to give Blessed some money for his crusade, but Blessed refused. According to many of his close associates, the meeting with Blessed in 1984 marked the beginning of a born-again Christian experience that would culminate several years later in Kennebunkport, Maine, during a meeting with another famous evangelist. Jesus once said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." For years, George W. Bush had been calling himself a Christian, but living a life that was far from God. But in the summer of 1985, all of that changed. During this period, the Bush family made a habit of inviting the evangelist Billy Graham, a friend of the family, to spend a few days each summer at the Bush's vacation home in Kennebunkport.
Billy Graham would sit down in the living room and answer religious questions from whoever wanted to ask them. It became something of an informal Bible camp for the Bush family, and it had a cumulative effect on George W. He could see very clearly the Lord reflected in Billy Graham's quiet and loving demeanor, and he was deeply moved by it. George W. would later say that it wasn't so much Graham's teaching that struck him, but the sheer presence and character of the aging evangelist.
In the summer of 1985, after a particularly moving question and answer session with Reverend Graham the night before, Bush and the evangelist took a walk on the beach together. During their conversation, Graham asked the future president, "Are you right with God?" Bush replied, "No, but I want to be."
His whole life he'd been influenced by Christianity. Yet when Billy Graham asked him if he was right with God, he couldn't say yes.
All of his close friends agree that the Graham encounter was absolutely the event in George W.'s Christian life. He himself said that after his talk with Graham, he felt himself drawn to seek something different in his spiritual walk, something real, and that's when his life really began to change.
That level of commitment is encouraging, but would it hold up against the temptations and compromises of the modern political world? While George W.'s personal life was undergoing radical changes, his professional life was changing as well. In 1986, Bush Sr. enlisted his son's help in running his presidential campaign. As he spent time in Washington, George W. got an up-close view of the seamier side of politics. The conviction of his newfound faith was soon put to the test.
George Bush did more than just talk the talk. I remember staffers trying to get him to have intimate relations with a young lady on our staff. Of course, probably what was going on was political blackmail leverage on the son of the future President of the United States. He'd look at me and raise his eyebrows like, "Do you believe that?" On one occasion, I remember a public figure whose name you'd immediately know came in and said, "She just wants you to relax, George. She's just trying to help you relax. You've hurt her feelings." He said, good. He yelled it so loud you could hear it through all the offices. He said, not interested. I'm a married man. I'm glad she got the message. Good. As far as I know, that was the last time she ever bothered him.
But there is more than one kind of temptation in politics. Would the integrity of Bush's newfound faith stand up to all of them?
I had a congressman who wanted to see him. He had a good cause, a good project, and he wanted George W.'s help. So I had him rehearse what he was going to say in advance so I could be sure it was okay. And he got to this point in his rehearsal where he said, and George, there's going to be something in this for you too. I said, don't do that. You'll turn him off. It will end. Your whole idea is going to die right at that point. And the congressman argued with me. He said, you know, that's not how things are done here in Washington. This is quid pro quo here. And I said, look, you know Washington, you know politics, I know GW, and I'm telling you, you don't say that to him. And so sure enough, we meet with GW, and he goes through this whole thing, and GW is listening, and then he gets to that part, there's something in this for you. And GW bolts out of his chair, he goes over, he kind of lifts this congressman to his feet, and he walks him to the door and says, great conversation, I'm busy now, see you later. It was a great idea, but George W. didn't want any part of it. I mean, anything even remotely shady. It's this sense of ethics that I believe is faith-based.
After the election, Bush returned to Texas and, in what many thought was a foolish move, risked a major portion of his total net worth on a failing baseball franchise, the Texas Rangers. Close friends believed he was indulging a boyhood fantasy for the game he loved. Instead, he built a new stadium for the Rangers and turned the losing franchise into a winner. His success in Texas baseball was the stepping stone to a political career. Just 2 years after his father became president, George W. Bush would make the leap into politics by running for the governor of Texas, an office that even some Bush family members believed he couldn't win. It was a political victory that many have called simply impossible. Bush became the second Republican to be elected governor of Texas since the end of the Civil War.
I think it's safe to say that had George W. Bush not rededicated his life to Christ, he would not have been elected governor of Texas. He defeated Ann Richards, who was a popular, tough Democratic governor. She had run a nasty, negative campaign in her previous election, and she tried to bait George W. into responding in kind in the campaign in which he defeated her, but he refused to engage. She called him Shrub, as in a little bush, to insinuate that he was riding his father's coattails. She even called him a jerk during the campaign, but she couldn't get George W. to take the bait. He ran a positive campaign and won with 54% of the vote. And I think part of the reason he won is that people saw evidence of the truth in him. They saw his goodness, his kindness, his truthfulness, his self-control. All these things are evidence of his walk with God.
I think he had had such a profound spiritual experience in his life that it changed his, not only his attitude, but his actions. I believe that he became a man under control, not out of control. I think that he became a man obviously guided not only with conviction, but convictions that came from principles. And he seemed to be able to express the fact that he did love his neighbor. That was more than a campaign phrase. He was loving his neighbor even when sometimes they weren't speaking well of him. And I think that was an indication of a real change in his life.
My relationship with God through Christ has given me meaning and direction. My faith has made a big difference in my personal life as in my public life as well. And I pray. I pray for guidance. I pray for patience. I firmly believe in the power of intercessory prayer, and I know I could not do my job without it.
People need to understand the difference between different types of Christian leaders. One type of Christian leader uses everything to convert people to Christianity. Another type of Christian leader uses their strength to serve everybody. In George Bush's case, he wants everybody to be better off. He's a real servant leader.
Could it be that this attitude of service is what propelled him into the White House? Or was it simply unbridled ambition, a need to follow in his father's footsteps? Would he carry that same conviction and dedication as President of the United States? One of the new president's first proposals was to call for something he called faith-based initiatives. He defined himself as a compassionate conservative and said this program was designed to help religious groups and organizations better serve the poor and indigent in their communities. Opponents insisted it was a transparent attempt to buy votes with taxpayer money. There is no precedent in American history for the Bush administration's determination to infuse government with a highly specific set of religious values, wrote Susan Jacoby of the Los Angeles Times.
I find that a curious view of history, as George Washington in 1789, in his inaugural address, said that the propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right which heaven itself has ordained. Our 30th president, Calvin Coolidge, wrote, "The foundations of our society and our government rest so much on the teachings of the Bible that it would be difficult to support them if faith in these teachings would cease to be practically universal in our country."
The big question is, have we reached that point in our history where faith in the Bible is no longer practically universal? Or is it possible that George Bush, by his faith-based example, is leading the nation in a reawakening of those principles upon which it was founded? As governor of Texas, George Bush was dealing with a constituency that he understood, and that understood his religious faith. His faith-based initiatives, instituted in Texas, were designed to remove roadblocks that prevented religious organizations from participating in charitable work, and they were implemented with relatively little opposition. It began with a highly successful drug rehabilitation program called Teen Challenge, which was under assault by state of Texas regulators. Their director, fearing that they were about to be shut down, called Bob Woodson, president of the National Center for Neighborhood Enterprise in Washington, D.C.
I met President Bush during his first year as governor of Texas. He inherited a bureaucracy that attempted to close down Teen Challenge, one of the state's most effective drug and alcohol treatment programs, because it used faith as the principal means of delivering people. I organized a demonstration at the Alamo that got his attention. I had a one-on-one with him, and he said to me, "Bob, I had no idea that our government was doing this to these faith-based groups. What is it that I can do?" And we worked with the governor. Within 6 months, his administration proposed rule changes that exempted all 200 faith-based drug and alcohol treatment programs from throughout the state from state regulations.
But in Washington, D.C., the same idea ran headlong into the wall of separation between church and state.
Talk about separation of church and state. It's not separated at all in Bush's brain. He's an unsuitable office holder.
In 1963, the Supreme Court, without citing a single precedent, handed down a ruling that turned nearly 200 years of constitutional law on its head. Prayer in public schools, the court said, was unconstitutional. Separation of church and state became a mantra that over the years has pitted the courts against virtually every public institution, including itself. By the time George W. Bush reached the presidency, the courts and other officials were going so far as to attack prayer in elementary school. In Texas, a district judge told high school students that any student uttering the word Jesus at the school's graduation would be arrested and locked up. In Missouri, a fourth grader who bowed his head in silent prayer before his lunch is ridiculed for his religious beliefs and given a week's detention. In a New York kindergarten, Kayla Broadus held hands with two students seated next to her while reciting a small prayer over her food. She was silenced and scolded by the teacher and taken before the school's lawyer, who concluded her behavior violated the separation of church and state. This settled court policy, some 40 years in the making, was the barrier faced by Bush and his faith-based initiatives. Indeed, that attitude permeated virtually anything the president said or did that touched on faith in any way. But some powerful voices were beginning to speak out against the radical shift in public policy regarding the careful balance in the relationship between church and state.
Everyone today seems to think the Constitution expressly provides for separation of church and state. Ask any 10 people if it's not so, and I'll bet you most of them will say, well, sure. And some will point out, it's in the First Amendment. Wrong. Read it. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Where is the word separate? Where are the words church or state?
Even the current Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, William Rehnquist, has written that the U.S. was not founded on church-state separation. In its 1963 ruling, the High Court, he said, ignored history, legal precedent, and the constitutional framers' clear intent. But when President George W. Bush suggested faith-based initiatives on a national level, opposition was thunderous. Robin Lovin, a Southern Methodist University ethics professor, said,
"Clearly what I'm hearing is a sense of religious calling, and not even around the mission or goal of the country, but a sense of religious calling for the policies of this president."
But in spite of the criticism, George W. Bush continues to be George W. Bush. Even on his days off, he walks the talk of his faith.
It was quite an honor to be invited to the ranch. I told my wife prior to getting there, I hope we just get in this white pickup truck and go. I hadn't been there a minute before he showed me around the house and said, as soon as I get through letting you see the home here and our house, he said, I want us to get in that pickup truck and we're going to get out of here. I thought, well, that's great, and sure enough, we did. We began to ride with the dogs in our lap and spilling his coffee, and he's trying to balance it as we rode along. He's telling me about the trees, about how much he enjoys the running creek water and the low water crossings and the wildlife. And he said, I want to show you something. He said, we talked about the importance of praying and getting alone where you can really meditate. And he said, let me show you where I go. And basically, he was going to show me a couple of places, and he pointed to a high hill. He said, I get up there alone and I really pray and I seek God's will and ask for God's blessings and direction. And the dogs are moving about, and we just had a great time of fellowship, but we talked about God. We talked about concerns for our country and issues of life. And he is a man that really does want wisdom and wants people to pray for him. And he believes that we need insight, not only from wise counsel, but beyond ourselves. He believes that God can direct us in our thoughts and in our actions.
George W. does not believe that he sees handwriting on the wall or hears an audible voice from God. What he does believe is that he senses the promptings of God in his heart, and he speaks in those terms in his private moments. Many of those around him urge him to be even more attuned to those promptings from God.
I don't know how in the world George could do his job without the spiritual and moral and loving support that Laura gives him. She is such a component of his persona that I can't imagine him having a life without her.
Laura Bush is a wonderful co-laborer with the president. She doesn't dominate him, she doesn't upstage him, but she supports him and she strengthens him, and I think she gives him courage.
Regardless of the political outcome, there have been a great many changes at the White House. The president encourages Bible study, opens meetings with prayer, and unabashedly references God in his public pronouncements. According to Newsweek magazine, quote, "This presidency is the most resolutely faith-based in modern times, an enterprise founded, supported, and guided by trust in the temporal and spiritual power of God." And BBC correspondent Justin Webb reported that nobody in government spends more time on his knees than George W. Bush. The Bush administration hums to the sound of prayer. Prayer meetings take place day and night. It's not uncommon to see White House functionaries hurrying down corridors carrying Bibles. His example has brought about a national phenomenon called the Presidential Prayer Team. The person responsible for that is Megan Gillen, the Director of Communication.
The Presidential Prayer Team is a nationwide initiative whose sole goal it is to stimulate prayer for the President, his cabinet, and other key leaders on his team. It exists in perpetuity to support in prayer whoever occupies the Oval Office. In addition, we call our members to prayer for the members of our military who serve around the world, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan. It spread like wildfire across the nation, and before we knew it, we had 5,000, 10,000, some days as many as 28,000 people joining this effort to pray for the President. Today, we're happy to say we have over 3 million participating, and some weeks we have over 10 million hits on our website, all people inquiring about prayer.
Prayer meetings and Bible reading sessions were and are still conducted in the various departments of government. They're not mandatory, but they're not held in secret either. And George Bush clearly responds to those who reach out to him spiritually.
I remember when the President met Putin in June of 2001 in Slovenia. It was not long after he'd become president, and Bush said something rather flattering to Putin like, "I saw this guy, I looked into his soul, and he's a good man." Of course, at the time, Bush was ridiculed by the foreign policy establishment for naivety. But look what happened. The degree of trust that enabled American aircraft to fly over Russia when the US was attacking the Taliban in Afghanistan is absolutely astonishing. I mean, I don't think that would have happened with any other American president except Bush.
And it's not just officials who get special attention from the President. Sam Hainem is an all-American kid with dreams for a bright future. But a deadly disease, cystic fibrosis, threatens to cut his life short and makes every day a struggle to survive. Because the outcome of his disease is uncertain, Sam makes the most of every opportunity that comes his way.
The Starlight Foundation is an organization that grants wishes to children with serious and terminal illnesses. And when they approached Sam to grant him a wish, the thing he wanted most was to meet the President of the United States.
I wrote them a letter telling them how much I appreciated the President being a Christian and a man of faith. And I wrote them a letter requesting that I meet him. And they got my letter and accepted my request.
Sam's visit was scheduled for March 12th, just 3 days after his 13th birthday. And although the family didn't know it at the time, their visit to Washington would come just 1 week before the start of the Iraqi war.
With all that was going on, the most powerful man in the world took time out of his schedule to meet with my son. It blew me away. It just really touched my father's heart. At any time in this whole process, he could have canceled because we were right in the verge of going to war with Iraq. But he didn't. He kept his word and he kept the meeting with my son, and it really touched our family, and I know it touched my son.
Sam and his family arrived at the White House and were escorted into the diplomatic room by the Secret Service. The big moment had arrived.
The President and Laura Bush came into the room, and they were so friendly and kind. They took pictures with us, and the President asked me about my life at home, and even about my dog Mariah. It was extra special for me because the President has presidential time and personal time, and he took this out of his personal time to make it extra special. He did this for me just to bless me.
The President then gave young Sam a gift, an autographed baseball decorated with the presidential seal. But Sam had something very special for the President as well.
One of the things about children like Sam who suffer from cystic fibrosis is they have choices to make as to how they're going to handle their disease. And Sam's choice has been to draw closer to God, because there are some times when he's so sick he just doesn't know how he's going to make it. And rather than getting angry and bitter at God, he's just learned to draw closer. And Sam wanted to share that with the President.
I gave him a Bible that had President George W. Bush engraved on the outside. And on the inside, on a bookmark, were the initials F-R-O-G on it.
The President opened the Bible and, seeing the unusual bookmark, asked Sam to explain.
I told him that I'm a Christian, and whenever I see a frog bookmark, the letters remind me that the only way to live is to fully rely on God. And he said, "Well then, Sam, I guess that means I'm a frog too."
As their time together came to a close, Sam and his parents walked with the President and his wife to the White House helipad where Marine One was waiting.
And I said to him, "I just want to thank you for doing this for my son, and also to let you know that we're praying for you as a family. And as he looked back, there was almost like tears in his eyes, and he said, "Thank you. That means a lot to me."
The president and his wife boarded the helicopter. Their ultimate destination? The Azores, where British Prime Minister Tony Blair and the President of Spain were waiting to discuss the final details of Operation Iraqi Freedom. It's a sort of unwritten rule that the president will at no time take gifts to his aircraft. But on this particular day, he made an exception.
Laura Bush's assistant told my father that he personally asked for the Bible to be transported to Air Force One.
With the weight of the world on his shoulders, President Bush found a way to share time with a 13-year-old whose greatest wish was to give the president a Bible. But there were those in Washington who expressed a much different view of the president. Barry Lynn, executive director of Americans United, told a congressional panel,
"We continue to careen dangerously down the path of government-supported religion. Congress has a duty to apply the brakes. Madison would have been horrified at the notion that Congress or the president would embark on the reckless journey of taxpayer funding of religion."
But is that true? Did the founders, in fact, intend to keep religion in general and Christianity in particular out of government and public life? Is George W. Bush at cross purposes with the men who drafted the First Amendment? What did they believe about religion and the new government they were creating? Even a cursory reading of the pronouncements of the Founding Fathers would seem to indicate otherwise. Madison himself said,
"We have staked the whole of our political institutions upon the capacity of mankind for self-government, upon the capacity of each and all of us to govern ourselves according to the 10 Commandments of God."
The highest glory of the American Revolution was this: it connected in one indissoluble bond the principles of civil government with the principles of Christianity.
In point of fact, in 1782, the United States Congress voted a resolution stating, "The Congress of the United States recommends and approves the Holy Bible for use in all schools."
The idea of God as a participant in public life in America has been with us from the very beginning. Abraham Lincoln openly acknowledged that, "I have been driven many times upon my knees with the overwhelming conviction that I had nowhere else to go. My own wisdom and that of all about me seemed insufficient for that day." And barely 50 years ago, Dwight David Eisenhower stated, "Without God, there could be no American form of government nor an American way of life. Recognition of the Supreme Being is the first, the most basic expression of Americanism." President Bush, I'm sure, would agree with those sentiments.
My relationship with God through Christ has given me meaning and direction. My faith has made a big difference in my personal life as in my public life as well. I make decisions every day. Some are easy, and some aren't so easy. I have worries just like you do.
George W. Bush, it seems, is right in line with the Founding Fathers. But will he pay a political price for that devotion? It is an historic fact that every one of our 43 presidents have referred to God in their inaugural addresses. While most would agree that America was not established formally as a Christian nation, our forefathers were wise enough to lay a foundation that would sustain it for the long term. They unapologetically chose the Bible and its proven moral and ethical principles as that foundation. Perhaps the bigger problem for America today is its headlong rush to abandon those core principles. But will the president pay a political price for commitment to those principles?
John F. Kennedy, in his inaugural address, said the rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God. Harry S. Truman, in his inaugural, said we believe all men are created equal because we're created in the image of God. And then some say, well, they mentioned God, but they didn't mention Christianity. Well, I beg to differ. John Adams, the second president, in his inaugural address said, I consider a decent respect for Christianity among the best recommendations for public service.
I have moments of doubt, moments of pride, and moments of hope. Yet my faith helps a lot because I have a sense of calm, knowing that the Bible's admonition "Thy will be done," is life's guide. In this hectic world, there is something incredibly reassuring in the belief that there is a divine plan that exceeds all human plans.
All of these presidents in time of great calamity turned to God for guidance. Interestingly, the historic record does not mention a single instance of a general uprising against any show of faith by any president except against President George W. Bush. Could it be that in what is perhaps America's greatest crisis since the Civil War, faith from the White House is needed more than ever? Is it possible that the calamity that now faces the nation calls for a greater, not a lesser, devotion to faith? Will we discover that the test now facing the nation and the world is more than a test of physical strength? The fact that the president's faith in God is firm and activates much of his life would seem to be beyond dispute. But what does that mean to the average citizen? How does it set him apart?
I think his faith affects him the same way Abraham Lincoln's faith affected him. Gave him a clear definition of what was right and wrong, and also gave them an internal courage that gave him the ability to do what was right even when public opinion was against him.
And he said, you know, God really did change my life. And he said, you know, I never wanted anything to do with politics. I always wanted to, you know, just be the fella, even if as governor now, which he said surprises me that I made this decision, but I'm glad I did. But he said, I want to be remembered as the man who walked in Walmart to buy fishing lures and used to be the governor. My dad was president. That's the only way I want people to think about me. But he said, I honestly believe that I am supposed to run for president. He said, I believe it's something God wants me to do. And he said, I can't explain it, but I believe my country is going to need me at this time.
On September 11th, 2001, that premonition came true. The nation and the world changed, perhaps forever. The events of 9/11 sent shockwaves around the globe. We watched the horror unfold at the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. President Bush walked away from the innocence of a gathering of school children in Florida to face the hatred and uncertainty of a group of madmen bent on destroying this nation. How would his sense of destiny serve him and the nation? How would he stand up to the monstrous evil that now faced America? Would we see him rise up in righteous wrath or sink to his knees in prayer? Or would this young neophyte president do both?
In all my years of presidency, I have never heard of a president having such a sense spiritually of what was going to happen while he was in office. I think this explains George W. Bush's sense of destiny. I think it explains his leadership style, and it also reveals why we saw such strength in him following September the 11th.
But once again, the president's willingness to admit that he seeks counsel from God ignited a critical firestorm unparalleled in American history.
Bush's, quote, national security strategy, unquote, amounts to an enormously presumptuous agenda for domination of the entire world.
I think that despite the way it's being spun, George W. Bush did wrestle with the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. I think, like Lincoln, he wanted to be on God's side of the issue. He knew he was sending young men and women to their deaths, and he knew he would be misunderstood.
I think that President Bush, with his vision and his leadership in a world troubled by terror, has the opportunity for greatness. His ability to stick with that, in spite of the fact that critics are attempting to force him off it, is what will determine whether or not the history books regard him as a great president. From everything I've seen so far, he is going to be that kind of president.
For a brief moment, when the mind-numbing horror of 9/11 was still settling in, America, once again, seemed to come together. America's churches were filled, and the nation looked to its leadership with hope and determination. Unhappily, the unity of purpose soon gave way to political expediency. Some high-ranking government officials actually suggested that Bush invented the tragedy of 9/11 for political purposes. Misguided critics have gone so far as to suggest that since the terrorists are driven by religious zeal, Bush's claim to religious beliefs makes him no different than the enemy. This reasoning suggests that somehow the specter of a Muslim terrorist strapping a bomb to his 14-year-old son is the moral equivalent of President Bush gathering a 14-year-old girl into his arms and hugging her to his chest, a girl whose mother was killed in the World Trade Center bombing. The nation, indeed the world, was catapulted into war on that September morning. Since then, the question has been, does the expressed and apparently deeply held faith of the man who occupies the White House bring us closer together as a nation, or does it drive us apart? September 14th, 2001. The men working at Ground Zero were in desperate need of a ray of hope. As smoke and ash floated through the air and settled on the weary rescue workers, President Bush made his way through the crowd.
He hadn't planned on giving any speeches, but when he saw the desperation and sadness on the faces of the men around him, he felt compelled to encourage them if he could.
I want you all to know that America today is on bended knee in prayer for the people whose lives were lost here, for the workers who work here, for the families who mourn. I can hear you. I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
It will probably be remembered as one of the greatest exchanges between a leader and his people in American history.
From that very moment, the world changed. Within a few short months, American military forces attacked al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. In a matter of weeks, the Taliban's deadly hold on the country was broken. Shortly thereafter, the most brutal dictator in the Middle East, Saddam Hussein, a man who defied the mandates of the United Nations and had openly supported terrorism, was also toppled. But for George W. Bush, it wasn't just a matter of defeating an enemy. It was an opportunity to bring hope and freedom and democracy to a part of the world where such things were unknown. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld has been quoted as explaining it this way. After our nation was attacked on 9/11, we fought back in Afghanistan, but we also made clear that America was not interested in conquest or colonization. And today, we are helping the Afghan people rebuild from the rubble of war and establish institutions of democracy. That is the American way. And even though it's largely ignored in the mainstream press, today in Iraq, the U.S. has rebuilt over 1,500 schools. All 240 hospitals and 1,200 clinics are open. Over 22 million Iraqi children have received vaccinations. Nearly all of Iraq's 400 courts are functioning. Power generation now exceeds the pre-war average, and the wheels of commerce are turning in all major cities and towns. And even as the argument over Hussein's weapons of mass destruction raged on, Muammar Gaddafi, the dictator of Libya, suddenly abandoned his atomic weapons program. Things are changing in the Middle East, and changing for the better.
President Bush will be known as the man that stood up to Islamic fundamentalism being used to tyrannize their own people. So in another 100 years, in the Islamic world, he'll be viewed as a great liberator and the one who began the process to set them free from those who use Islam to enslave Islamic people politically.
Even as President Bush seems to be staying the course on the battle against terrorism, he recently addressed the United Nations with the moral clarity of an Old Testament biblical prophet in challenging the nations of the world to eliminate modern-day slavery.
Each year, an estimated 800,000 to 900,000 human beings are bought, sold, or forced across the world's borders. Among them are hundreds of thousands of teenage girls and others as young as 5 who fall victim to the sex trade. The victims of this industry also need help from members of the United Nations. Such conduct should be a crime in all nations. The American government is committing $50 million to support the good work of organizations that are rescuing women and children from exploitation. I urge other governments to do their part. We must show new energy in fighting back an old evil.
But will George W. Bush be allowed to finish the battle against the forces of evil that threaten our very existence? One thing appears to be certain. He has already paid a very high price politically for this dedication. One Hollywood filmmaker who claims to be non-political has written and produced what he calls a documentary that many critics quickly disclaimed as pure propaganda, dedicated to the sole purpose of damaging the president's image. One such reviewer, Christopher Hitchens, is a columnist for Vanity Fair and had this to say: Fahrenheit 9/11 is a sinister exercise in moral frivolity, crudely disguised as an exercise in seriousness. In the meantime, and through it all, President Bush continues to lead by example.
There were a group of people visiting a hospital ward where there were a lot of U.S. soldiers wounded in the Iraqi war. They came across a young man who'd had his arm amputated. There was an embarrassed silence. Nobody quite knew what to do, and then the president stepped forward. He knelt down by the bedside, took the stump in his hands, said a small prayer, then kissed the bandage. This was just an astonishing display of uninhibited kindness to a wounded soldier.
In still another unprecedented display of caring, President Bush met a young soldier in the hospital who had lost his leg to a landmine in Afghanistan. Bush promised the young man when he could run a mile, they would run together. True to his word, the president checked with the hospital every month, and in May 2004, George Bush and Army Private Mike McNaughton went for a mile run. Not all Americans agree that we have always had the right man in the right position in a moment of crisis. But one thing is indisputable. Those who have led the nation in its darkest moments have always been willing to humble themselves before God and to call the nation to prayer. President George W. Bush has set the example for maintaining faith in the face of unrelenting criticism. In my book, Tough Faith, I presented a roadmap through the dangerous deception that lies ahead. As the president has so ably demonstrated, it is vitally important for Christians to be fully engaged in the religious and cultural conflicts of the 21st century. Will the faith of George Bush be sufficient to keep us in God's hands today? Perhaps, if we all join our faith to his.
As we've been assured, neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor height, nor depth can separate us from God's love. May he bless the souls of the departed. May he comfort our own. And may he always guide our country. God bless America.